All right, hi everyone. Welcome to our April 2023 Portals Community Call. I'm Jason Gilbert from MSDynamicsWorld.com. As always, I am pleased to have the privilege of hosting these Portals events with our lead presenter and I guess real host, Nick Hayduk. Nick, welcome back for today's event. Just one quick note as we start. If you in the audience have any questions, we definitely welcome those in the questions block of the webcast interface. Enter them at any time. And I know Nick will keep an eye on them. I will as well. Also, we are recording today's event, so please be on the lookout for information on the recording after the session ends. With that, I think we're ready to begin. Nick, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Alrighty, thank you very much. Okay, today we will be talking about lists. And so what we talked about last month was forms. I touched a little bit on multi-step forms and wanted to kind of continue the conversation about lists and touch on multi-step forms a little bit more because we kind of ran out of time last time. So we'll see how much of this we can get through this week. Yeah, there's probably hours and hours of content that we could talk about in lists and multi-step forms. So let's see what we can get through today. But first, I guess, quick introduction. If you are new to these calls, my name is Nicholas Hayduk. I am the president and software engineer with Engineered Code Consulting Inc., based here in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I've been working with Power Pages, Power Apps Portals, that kind of line of products, basically since the beginning, having started my career with ADX Studio way back in the day. If you haven't already connected with me on LinkedIn or follow us on Twitter, we have our blog, which thankfully we've kind of started doing that again, probably about once a month. We'll have a blog post. We have our YouTube channel where we put out not only the recordings of these community calls, but we do have weekly tips that we produce as well. And we've got crm.audio, which is where we host the podcast. So George Dubinsky and I do a podcast. We just released one, I think, last week. We've got another one in the queue, and we'll be recording more. So if podcasts are your thing, go ahead and check that out. All right, moving on here. As always, just want to extend my appreciation to Jason Gilbert and the whole team at MS Dynamics World for their support with this whole Power Pages or community calls that we're doing, Portals community call. They've been a great partner since the beginning, and I really appreciate their support on getting this done. So what is our agenda? As usual, we have a section here at the beginning, Portal News, a couple of cool, or I think three news items this month. So that's great to see. Lots of new stuff coming out from Microsoft, and then we'll get into today's topic, which is a deep dive. As I mentioned, the deep dive continues with lists and more on multi-step forms. So let's dive right into it. Let's talk about what's new in the last month, or I guess it's probably been closer to 6 weeks since our last call. So let's take a look and see what's new. The first thing I have on my list here is there is a new FAQ template, so a new Power Pages template. So if you go in and you're installing Power Pages, there's a there's a bunch of templates that you have to pick from in order to install one, and we've got a new one. So that's a frequently asked questions template. So go ahead and take a look at that one. And I personally haven't dived too deep into it, so but I will be probably doing that shortly because typically we feature those on our tips. So I do intend on diving into that a little bit more, but it is there for people to take a look at. I think last time I checked, it still was in preview, but yeah, certainly something you can, I think, install right now and play around with. So next, there are new features to configure lists in the Power Pages Design Studio. Now, I'm not going to go too much into that now because that's essentially coincidentally what our topic is this month. However, yeah, I just want to raise that there are some new blog posts or new features in the ability to configure lists. Next, we have some improvements in the VS Code integration. So if you're using the Pack CLI to download your Power Pages data and edit it in VS Code, there's a few different options here. So improved IntelliSense. So that would be IntelliSense in the I think it's mostly related to Liquid, so it's going to be kind of prompting you and helping you complete those without making as many errors as you might if IntelliSense didn't exist, as well as the ability to create, delete, or rename certain types of tables directly in VS Code as well. So that's the ability to kind of rename files and have those operations applied directly to Dataverse. So a few options in there as well for improvements to VS Code. All right, and to be honest with you, there was a ton of community content out there. I know Nick Dolman, Franco, Muzo, I think Ulrike. There's a ton of social content, so I didn't list it all here. But yeah, there's never really been a better time to be in this space. Tons of activity in the community, so lots of great content out there. So keep an eye out, and we try to share as much as we can on our social channels as well. Okay, moving right along. So today's topic, like I said, a deep dive into forms and multi-step forms. Or sorry, a deep dive into forms and multi-step forms. I didn't change the title of my thing. That's great. Sorry, that should have been, again, lists and multi-step forms. I must have missed that when I copied and pasted. Oh well, because I didn't really prepare any slides for today because I just want to dive right into the actual interface. So let's do that right now. So I'm going to go to make.powerpages.microsoft.com, and we're first going to start off with lists. So I'm going to open this up. I'm going to go into my Power Pages Design Studio, which I get to by clicking the Edit button. And I'm going to show you the capabilities that exist around the lists. So hopefully, if you're coming to this call, you're maybe already familiar with Dataverse. You're familiar with hopefully the kind of model-driven apps and views. So lists are the way that we display views in Power Pages. So if you've got a view of a certain table of data from Dataverse, the way we expose that on Power Pages is via the list functionality. So I'm going to just go into here. I'm going to create a new page just for us to play around with. I'm going to call it community call lists. We don't need it in the main navigation. I'm just going to say start from blank. So you can see right here, we have list. So this is one of the components that we can add to a section in the Power Pages Design Studio. If I do that, we get the option to either select an existing list that we've already created, or we can create a new list. I'm going to create a new list. Next, what we have to do, so if we're creating a new list, a list is always based on a single table in Dataverse. So we have to select from our tables here. My examples are always around golfing. So I'm going to select, I want to create a table of golf courses. Next, what I do is I select the views. So similar to when you're looking at a view in a model-driven app, you kind of have the drop-down where you can select from all the different views that are available to you. The list functionality works the same way in Power Pages. So you have to select at least one list, but you can select kind of multiple, or you have to select at least one view, but you can select multiple as well. So I'm going to select active golf courses, and I'm going to select portal search just to kind of give me some variety. And I'm going to name my list. I'll just leave the default here, but actually maybe I'll change this to lists. Golf courses. So that's the name of my list. The name of my list doesn't really show up anywhere publicly to the users, but it's kind of referenced in a few places in the back end here. So I'm going to click done and see what that gets me. So what it gives me is a simple table that has the columns as defined in my views. So again, I've included two views here. So whatever columns show up on those views will be displayed here, and then the rows that I have access to. So let me just go ahead and click the preview button and see what this actually looks like. So we've got our list. In our case, we have 2 active courses. Now, it's important to always keep in mind that when you're dealing with lists and forms, we have to consider permissions. So because I was working on this earlier, I've got all the permissions set up. But if I were to go in here, I can go to permissions. Let's just say I go to golf courses. And right now what I have is a global access, but let me just change this. Before I had this set up as contact access, and I was only able to see the ones where I was the superintendent. So I'm going to click save. Close, preview. Now you can see I've got no records returning because I have only permission to ones where I'm associated to as a superintendent, and in this particular user that's logged in isn't in that case. So the important thing to understand is that when you're looking at this table, the rows that are returned are filtered twice. First, they're filtered by whatever filter criteria exists on the view. Secondly, it's filtered by whatever permission the person who's logged in, or if they're anonymous, whatever permissions they have. So I'm going to go back to this, and I'm going to make this back to global just so I can see things. Close. So this should get me my permission or my 2 records back. So I've kind of demonstrated here how the permissions apply filtering, but if I go in and I edit my views, so I can edit the underlying views directly here. So I'm going to change my active golf courses one. So I've got my columns. We got some filter criteria. I'm going to edit the filters here, where I'm going to say the name begins with Augusta. I'm going to save. I'm going to publish that. I'm going to go back to my list here. Preview. Now I'd expect to only see Augusta. Of course, that never works when you're trying here. Might just be a caching thing. Been playing around with it today, and it seems like caching is a little slow this morning. Yeah, there we go. So again, important to keep in mind. So if you're not seeing any records, if you're not seeing the record you're expecting when you create a basic list like this, think about 2 things. Think about what filter criteria exists on the views that you're actually using. Now, if I switch this, I go to portal search, I'm going to see no records there. There must be some filter criteria on there as well, but is this where I've got stats reason? Yeah. So if I go, you can see here I'm getting different results because the filter criteria is different on each one of those views. So keep in mind that you have to consider the filter criteria in the views and the permissions that the current user has. It's extremely common to get lots of questions about people not getting the data in their views that they're expecting, and that's the number one reason is that either their filters are incorrect or their permissions. It's honestly, it's usually the permissions. The people who are familiar with views kind of understand the filter criteria, but often they'll kind of forget about the permissions. Okay, so now we've got a pretty simple view. This includes basic paging. So if I had a whole lot more records in here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly go back into here, go into this. I'm just going to get rid of that filter criteria. Just so that we have a couple more records in here. So out of the box, these lists, I'm just going to change this for a second, just so that you can see the paging. So now we have 2 pages worth of data. So you can control the paging size, but these lists out of the box come with paging. They come with sorting by clicking on the column names. So this is what you get with a kind of the most basic list that you can create on a page. Now let's talk about some more advanced options. So in addition to just showing a grid of records, which again is controlled by the views that you create, you can also allow people to create records, download contents, view details, edit records, and delete records. So if I turn on the create new records, we've got a few options here. And this is basically controlling the user experience for what does the user see when they go to create a new record. So there's essentially 3 options for what they can see. So one is form, and this will pop open a form in a modal. So if I were to do this, select form, maybe do this one, and I'll say create, done. What that's going to do, when I go here, we'll get a create button that pops up here. And when I do that, it pops up in a modal. You can see we're still on that same page, but we're doing a create. Now, the reason I'm seeing an error there is because the Design Studio, if I go into where I selected it, there were 2 different forms. Now, if I look at this golf course form, it's most likely not an insert. It's not a create. It's probably a read-only or a create. So A, you need to name your thing properly. We'll see if maybe that one's an insert. So if I do done, do that, go over here, see if that one gets me the ability to create. Yeah, so here's our ability to create a new golf course. Submit. So now you can see we've got 3 pages because it's already created that record for us. So that's the form option. Web page essentially will redirect to any page that you've got here on your Power Pages site. Now, generally the idea is that that page will contain the form, or I guess these days it could be a completely custom form built with the web API that actually creates the record. But essentially this is just doing a redirect. There's really nothing fancy in this, and same with URL. If you want to redirect this to a particular URL, new golf course, you can do that. Now, just know that with URL, it has to be an internal URL. So this is only relative. You can't have it go to an external URL. So those are essentially the options. Web page, again, if you're redirecting to a web page, most likely you have a form or custom logic on there that would actually build it out. So web page and URL are basically redirects, whereas the form will display a form you've already created in a modal pop-up box. And then, yeah, you can just control what the label says on the actual button. You also have the ability to download the contents of the list. So if I check that, make that form done, preview. So now I get this download button, active golf courses. It's going to give me an Excel file with all the data that existed on that particular view. Other actions that we have in here. So this was the list action. So these ones, as you can see, those buttons kind of appear above the list because they're not related to any particular record. The next section we have here are actions that you can perform on specific records. So the first one here is view details. You'll see that this is very similar to the create. You can either have it target a form, a web page, or a URL. With a form, it's going to pop up in that modal. Web page and URL are going to do redirects. The only thing that's kind of special about the row actions is that it will include the ID of the record in the query string. So let's just assume I was going to do URL and I was going to say it's going to go to edit course. Now this page doesn't exist, I don't think, but let's just pretend it did. So you can see I'm saying URL, edit course, PCC, done. Now if I preview that, what you're going to get is a little drop-down button here with that link. Now if we click that, you can see that's going to take me over to that edit core PCC with the ID of the record I was trying to edit. Now again, the idea is that you would create that page using either advanced forms, basic forms, a basic form, a form, or a multi-step form, and then you would have it kind of configured to accept that query string parameter so it knew which record or which row you were trying to edit. You could also, again, use Web API to do the updates if you want to build more of a custom form. So that's kind of how it works for the view and the edit. So I got this view details. You'll also notice that as soon as I put that in that dropdown, this the first column in the list also becomes a link as well. So if I click that, it takes me to the same place. So I do have the options for view and edit. The options are the same. And in fact, similar to how when I tried to create a new record, I pointed at a form that really wasn't compatible. I pointed at an edit form, not an insert. You can, when you go into here, if you say form, you in theory could point this at an edit form. Nothing's going to stop you. Like the system doesn't validate that the form is of the right type. The reason that we have a view details and an edit, separate ones, is that the system is smart enough to say, if, for example, you have both a view and edit set up, if a user doesn't have edit rights on a particular record, it will hide the edit button from them. So even if your form, say, pointed at a view, like a read-only form, the fact that you've defined it in the edit button means that that button will disappear for that person. So, so basically play along, even though it's not necessarily enforced. If you're just doing a read-only form, use the view. If you're doing the edit, if it's editable, use the edit, because then the system will kind of hide and show buttons automatically based on the user's permissions. And finally, with the delete, we've got the option here to delete the record. Again, that's only going to, let me do that one, golf course and golf course. That's going to put more options in the dropdown. That's to reload. So in my case, I don't have the permission to delete, so you'll see that the delete button doesn't actually appear, even though I've configured it. You'll also note that this button right here, if you configured both an edit and the view details, this one will kind of go to the edit if you've got available, if you have access to both. So kind of the edit overrides the view details. I'm just going to modify my permissions here on golf courses and say, yes, I do have the ability to delete. Once I do that, you'll see that the button should show up here. So it is enforcing those permissions and doing what it can in the UI, not to give users options that they don't have access to. So now I have the delete button. So those are the options that exist under here. We have a few options in here. One I've already kind of touched on, it's just the number of records per page, so I'll make that 2. And you can also enable search. This is just a simple kind of quick find type search, so I'll enable that and show you what that looks like. It's having a little, cache is a little slow this morning, this afternoon. A little search box that shows up right there. So there I can type and say Augusta, and it does the filtering there. So just a simple little quick search type interface. I can do so it's going to search not just the ones that are on that page, but all of So that kind of covers the basic settings that we have in the Power Pages Design Studio in terms of editing the list. Now, they also, we've talked about how we can edit the views, we've talked about the permissions, we can move this list thing up and down, we can remove this list, all that sort of stuff. The other really cool feature that has been added to the Power Pages Design Studio is the filters. So these filters allow you to add additional, so we've talked about kind of the basic search, but we've got the filters, which, let's just do an example of, let's just do a quick text one where I say I want to search based on the name. So whereas the search thing will kind of search across all the different columns, I'm going to add some filtering on the name specifically. Get the cache cleared here. There we go. So now if I wanted just to search on the name, I can put that in there and I can click the apply button and it's only going to search in the name. Now that's a pretty simple one. Let's talk about some of the other more complex ones. So we've got checkbox. So checkbox, and let's just use name again. So this is great if you have some, say, common options that the user wants to filter. So in this case, we can say is Augusta, and we have another option that says is, oh, sorry, that would have to be Augusta National, and we say is Wascana Country Club. So if we do that as a checkbox, it will show those checkboxes. Once the page loads, so now I can say apply, and it's going to just filter. I can do that. Now it's going to show me just my two. So again, if you have specific options that you know are going to be popular, rather than forcing someone to kind of type them on, maybe have typos, you can apply these checkboxes. Now, where that can get super cool is you can actually do, I'm going to add a filter here for checkboxes. Now, imagine if there was a price, and so I actually have what the green fee, so basically the cost to play the course. You can say use range for options. So in this case, you can say, I'm going to call this one, so is less, so let's say is not empty and is less than 50. And we'll call this one less than 50. We're going to add another option here that says is more than or equal to 50, less than or equal to 100. And this can be 50 to 100. And then we can add one more option here where not empty and is more than 100. And there we can say more than 100. So now we've got this range of options where we can select and kind of filter things based on, you know, I want to find all the ones where it's 50 to 100, or this one, and you can kind of combine those options with the range. So you can build some pretty cool search interfaces with these filters. Drop-down and radio buttons are very similar in that they allow you to define those different options. And what you can also, I guess the difference between drop-down and checkbox is that when you select drop-down or when you select radio button, you can only select one of these. So you can only have one active at one time, whereas with checkboxes, you can have multiple. So that's really the difference between checkbox and these other two. Radio button and drop-down, again, are similar in terms of functionality, just a different UI. So you can either have a drop-down where people select from them, or radio buttons if you have what to show them. Usually, if you only have 2 or 3 options, maybe radio button looks better, but if you have a whole bunch of options, say you have 10 options, drop-down is a little bit more concise of the UI. Finally, we do have this custom option here that they gave us. This allows you to paste in some fetch XML filtering and have the options show up here. So it's a little bit more advanced. I'm not going to get too much into that today, but if you're kind of going through all these different filtering options and you're not getting what you need, consider that you might be able to achieve what you're looking for by doing the fetch XML filtering. So that kind of covers the basic options that we have when we're building lists in the Power Pages Design Studio. But if you've ever kind of heard me talk about the Power Pages Design Studio before, you know that it only offers a subset of the functionality. So there's more that we can do if we switch over to the Portal Management app. Now, I think they've done a pretty good job. I think 80% of the time, you're going to be able to configure your lists through the features that they have here. But if I go to the Edit Lists, I go to More Options, and I click Open Portal Management app, that's going to take me into the Portal Management app for that specific list, and we'll see all the different options that we actually have to work with. Now, a lot of the things that, obviously all the features that we just saw are represented in this interface as well. So as I mentioned, you have the name, you have the table that you're selecting, you've got the website. Here is where you select the views. So if you want to add more views, you can do that here. Page size, query string parameter name. We've got some options for what the buttons look like. Now, this one is the area that I find people get confused with a lot, because there's actually two different ways to have create and details pages. So you'll remember that I did set up a details page and I did set up a create page. But you'll see that these things are empty, because this is essentially using kind of an older way where you select just a web page for the details view, and you can select a web page for the create. This is kind of, think of this as version 1 of the product. And this was done, I don't know, probably 10 years ago. Then they introduced, when we go over to the options, they introduced this grid configuration, where we've got the basic form. And so the create, the details, the edit, this is where that's all configured. So my recommendation is, unless you really know, unless you have a real purpose for using this, I would avoid using the web page for details view and the web page for create. Instead, use the options that you can configure in the Power Pages Design Studio. And if you want to go in the back end and see where that actually works, that's in this grid configuration area. So even though there's kind of two different ways of doing it, I would stick with the grid configuration. Next, you can see here search enabled. That's the box we checked that added that kind of quick find capabilities. You can apply additional filter conditions. So I mentioned earlier that when you're looking at a list and there's a bunch of, you're looking and you see a bunch of rows of records, that you have to consider, what does the filter criteria say on the view and what do the permissions say? There is additional filtering you can do in here. So you can say, I want to filter and only bring me back records related to the current user. So rather than defining that criteria in the view, you can, or via permissions, you can do it here. Honestly, again, this is probably pretty underused, or it's not used a whole lot because there's kind of other ways of doing it. So, but here I could say only return records that are, in my case, it would be superintendent. This is also just kind of as a bit of an aside, you'll see that when it talks about the portal user, it references relationships. And so this is a list of columns on, and the table we're looking at here is golf course. This is a list of columns that exist on the golf course table that are related, that are look up to either the user record or the contact record. Now, anything that's related to the content or to the user record is irrelevant. I think really what happened here is at one point ADX Studio intended for users in Power Pages to also, you could also use system users, but that was never kind of sorted out. So that's why you'll see users in here, even though that would never work. So you can only really work with contacts in this case. So if I were to select this, it would apply additional filtering above and beyond both the permissions and the views filter criteria. It would apply this additional filtering, and you can do the same thing based on the website and the same thing based on the account. Now, in this case, my golf course table isn't related to the account or to the website, so that's why they're not showing up here. In terms of our metadata filters, this is those filters that we were configuring just a few minutes ago. So if I just kind of hop back here for a second, we've got this filter criteria. There's a few things we can do on here that I didn't show yet. So for example, you can rearrange them if you want to, and you can adjust the filter settings. So filter settings is you can have them horizontally on the top, or you can have them vertically on the side, and you can control the label here of apply. If I do that, you'll see that we get the filter options on the left-hand side. So those same options apply here. Now, you can see all those different filters that I set up are already kind of built for me because this was set up in that other interface. Now you will see that there are additional, if we look at this, we see text filter, well that kind of maps. We've got the range filter and the attribute filter. Those were the checkbox and you do checkbox. So you can see here that, let me just get rid of this. You can see that the range one I set up here is a range filter set, and the checkbox one I set here is an attribute filter set where I have checkboxes, radio buttons, or drop-down lists. But you'll see that there are additional options in here that didn't exist in the Design Studio. So that includes the lookup set. So this allows you to filter based on a particular lookup. There's also the dynamic pick list set and the dynamic lookup set. So there are some additional filter options, metadata filter options that you have access to in the backend that they just haven't built the UI in the front end yet for. I'm just going to try one thing here. That. Just going to add a edit views. I'm just going to add my superintendent lookup here just to see if maybe that's the reason that those extra options don't show up. Save, publish. Reload this. All right, so there's our superintendent. Yeah, no, they just have, I don't think they've implemented the user interface for those other ones yet. Okay, and so that's just kind of the first page. Now there are additional things. So there's this map view. This is relatively legacy technology, this map view. You can enable map view. It's expecting that on your table, you have lat and long fields so that it can display them on the map. And you've also got to set up kind of the bin maps integration. But if you are using, if you do have something that is map related, you can enable this and have it show all of the items that are in your list on a map. So it's pretty cool. There's also a calendar view. So if your list is actually of calendar events, you can check this box and it will display a calendar. So this is where you kind of map it and say, hey, this is a start time, end time, summary field. So you have to tell kind of where the data is coming from, but you can have it display in the calendar view as well. There is this OData feed. I know this has been deprecated, so I would strongly recommend that you just leave this disabled. There are better ways of getting OData feeds from Power Pages if you want them, so strongly recommend you just ignore this and don't check that off. And then we get into some more advanced options. So if you want to add custom JavaScript for your list, you can do that here. There's lots of cool things you can do with custom JavaScript. You can highlight certain columns or rows or that sort of thing, kind of conditional highlighting. But yeah, lots of different things you can do with JavaScript on lists. Next, we have the grid configuration, which is essentially talking about the similar features that we talked about before, the create, the download, the details, edit, delete, but you will see that there are a few more buttons that exist here that we didn't have. And I did see the question from Kim about Power Automate, and I wanted to kind of leave that for now because this is where that'll come up. So right now, we've got, in addition to details, edit, and delete, which we've already talked about, you have the ability to say add a button that shows up in that dropdown. So if we go back to here, we have buttons for view, edit, delete. You have the ability to add buttons that would run a classic workflow. So this is a kind of an old dynamic CRM style process workflow. You can also create a button that allows you to create a related record. You can also activate or deactivate the record. So you can add additional buttons here. Again, these are not available in the Power Pages Design Studio, but those capabilities exist. Now, Kim was asking about Power Automate. So integration with Power Automate, I believe, was discussed in the most recent Power Pages release notes. Power Pages release notes. Let's see if we can find those quickly. 2020, maybe 2023 release wave 1. Ooh. Let's see if we can. Are they consistent with their? No, they couldn't be consistent. Let's do Power Platform 2023 release wave 1. There we go. So let's just take a quick look as to use Cloudflow with Power Pages sites. So it says, using an API, professional developers can use Power Automate Cloudflows from Power Pages to integrate with external applications or automate their processes to meet their business needs. What they've talked about is the ability through the web API to call Power Automate flows. Now, hopefully what's kind of going to be coming at some point is, in addition to workflow, you'll be able to add Cloudflow here. But what's coming is you will be able to securely call Power Automate flows, or Power Automate Cloud flows, but it won't be quite kind of no code. You'll have to write a little JavaScript to add the button, and then write the JavaScript that will actually call the Power Pages web API, which will have a way to call a flow in Power Automate. So yes, it will be able to be done once this feature is released. It will require a few lines of JavaScript. Now, that being said, if you don't know JavaScript, I suspect that very quickly, if not us, someone will have a very simple blog post with, here's the code, drop it in there. Here's how it links to, copy in the name or the ID of your Cloudflow, and this will create that button. So again, it won't be necessarily configuration based, but copying in some code should make that pretty simple. My understanding is that essentially there'll be a new connector, like a Power Pages connector, that will include a trigger and that's how it kind of will get hooked up there. So you build a Power Automate flow using the Power Pages connector. Okay, so hopefully, Kim, that answers that question. Another question, can you modify the out-of-the-box list and add more columns in the JavaScript HTML? In the list created, can you modify the filter criteria in JavaScript? Can you add checkboxes where you can select all? Can add a custom button on the out-of-the-box list? So, the short answer to those questions is yes. All of this can be customized with JavaScript. Now, the thing to keep in mind, I'm going to just refresh this, is you'll see here with paging, the whole page doesn't refresh, just the grid refreshes. So Microsoft actually gives you an event, a JavaScript event that fires when the page, or not when the whole page, not when the web page, but when a page of data in the table is refreshed. So if you're going to do anything like adding columns, because essentially it's just kind of HTML and you can adjust the markup, you can add columns, that's totally fine. You just have to make sure you're doing it not when the page loads, you have to do it every time essentially the table reloads. And again, there's an event for that. Let's see, power pages list. I wonder if they have the documentation for that. Yeah, so you can see here, they give you kind of a sample jQuery where it's the entity list, entity grid onloaded. And so this function will fire every single time there's a new page of data. So in this particular case, it's getting all the ones where the data attribute account number is one of those, and then you can write a function. So I actually have an example on mine. If I go to this one, I was playing around with earlier. If I preview this one, it will actually, Augusta National will be green, I believe. Yeah, and so that's I've done with some JavaScript to say, hey, look for a particular record and highlight it as green. So yeah, there's not much you can't do with JavaScript. I've seen people do some pretty interesting things with how they do these filters. So yeah, all of this is pretty standard. Like if you look at the view source won't help us there, but if you go into developer tools, the markup for that is all pretty kind of structured. So you'd be able to target these things, entity list filter option, and use JavaScript to enforce your thing. So Hamida, hopefully that answers your question there. What else do we have here? Brett, think they'll ever give us a comprehensive count for the list underline view? This customer always wants a count with a list. So Brett, I'm sure like the total count of records. Do I think they'll ever do that? I hope so. I know that even like recently I've heard about requests. That's honestly not really a Power Pages thing. It's more of an underlying Dataverse thing. And so I do know that that's been raised like very recently. Yeah, I think it's hopefully something they're working on, but there's nothing like, I don't know if anything's imminent, but that is a complaint that Microsoft has heard, and hopefully at some point they'll do the work to address it. Another question from Hamid is, can you add a PCF control or write React controls on Power Pages? Yes. PCF controls, in theory, can be used on forms. So if you have a form and you want to replace a particular control, think of it, it's got very similar support to what PCF controls can do in model-driven apps. Honestly, last time I tried to get it to work when they were just out in preview, I couldn't get it to work on a list. But I believe the documentation says it's supported, so it's probably something that I was just doing wrong. So you can use a PCF control to basically redo the whole rendering of this list. You can use that for subgrids on a form. You can do it on a form. And if you have a PCF control, you can really insert it anywhere on your site using a liquid syntax. So yes, PCF is supported. Now, keep in mind that if you have existing PCF controls that you want to use, they may or may not be fully supported on Power Pages, because Power Pages supports different things than say like a Canvas app might, or model-driven app. Basically, the PCF controls really only support having like the web APIs dependency. You can't do like camera controls and some of those other ones. And the other thing that you have to consider is that if you're doing a PCF control, if you've built it for say a model-driven app, there's a good chance maybe you use the Fluent UI to make it look pretty and make it feel like it's part of the model-driven app. Whereas if you've done it on Power Pages, it's Bootstrap version 3, soon to be version 5. So it might look and feel a little bit different. But quickly, the answer is yes to PCF controls. Under whose context will Power Automate run if triggered from the portal? It will be running. I'm trying to think of like in terms of like it would be like a programmatically fired Right. So like I don't know if it will have. Yeah, I'm curious if it might have the context of the contact that ran it. That's I'm not sure. I haven't seen really the details of it. I don't know. So the connector can be triggered on demand. Will be capable of bidirectional data exchange. Developers will be able to authorize specific clouds step workplace. They can be securely invoked. So it does talk about how like the Cloudflow can return data. So it's more of a synchronous call than traditionally, like it's not like a call the API and forget it. It actually calls the Cloudflow and waits for a response, gets that and sends it back to the portal. But I don't know yet if the context of which contact ran it would be part of the trigger or not. I don't know that. Okay, I'm just going to quickly finish here on lists and then cover again the multi-step form that I didn't get a chance to last time. So again, yeah, the ability to create workflows, create related records, and the ability to activate or deactivate. And then this is just web pages. This is the web pages that it's related to. Now, just quickly, when you add a list in the Design Studio, these are being added via Liquid. So if I look at, say, the Liquid, the HTML code that actually exists here, we'll see that there is a Liquid include statement for the entity list. Entity lists are what lists used to be called. So that's how they're added to the page. So it's actually like the HTML for that page includes this Liquid. You can also, if you're doing it in the back end, if you go to a web page, there's a lookup on web page. I'm just going to open up anyone here. There's a lookup to lists. So that's another way to specify it on the page. If you use that method, it depends on which templates, because some templates don't kind of respect this setting. So we've kind of moved to forget that these kind of settings exist for the most part and just add them to the page via Liquid in the same way that the studio does. So you won't often see, I just don't want people to get confused, because you'd think that when I look at, go back to this list, if I look at the list on the web page, it says, oh, there's none here. That doesn't mean that it doesn't appear on any pages. This means it isn't directly linked to those pages. But if it appears on those pages via a Liquid include statement, it's not going to show up in this list. Brett says, regarding to which context the Power Automate flow will run, he says, as the flow owner, I suspect due to dependency on connections. Yes, I do believe it would technically run as the flow owner, but hopefully maybe that as part of the trigger, it will pass in the context of which contact performed the operation. Okay, I'm going to I guess what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just quickly jump back to here. I'll talk about the next call, which is May 18th. We've already got our topic picked out. So Franco Muzo, who's been a guest presenter here a number of times, will be coming back. He is helping the Scottish Summit, which is a community event run typically in Scotland. I think this year it's actually in Manchester. So, who knows what they're doing over there, but that's running, I believe, in the fall. Franco has offered to build them a new website using Power Pages. So he's going to just tell us all about that, what he's doing. So it'll be kind of an informative look at how to actually build a real project with Power Pages. So he'll be back next month on May 18th. Again, thank you to Jason and MS Dynamics World. So Q&A section, if you have any other questions, please drop them in the question block. Otherwise, I'm going to quickly try and just cover a couple more things with multi-step forms that I kind of rushed through, and I guess I'm going to rush through them again here today. Let me bring this up. So I just wanted to talk about with multi-step forms. Do I have one here? So we're talking about multi-step forms last time we talked about basic forms, which are just like a single form on a single form on a page. With multi-step forms, they're the same idea, except for you have multiple of these forms. So it's a wizard-like thing with multiple steps. So one of the things we were looking at last time that we kind of got to at the end was the ability to have conditional steps. So in this particular case, I got a multi-step form with 2 steps. I got step 1, step 2. Now, after step 2, I could have another step that instead of it being a load form, so actually display a form, I can say new form step. And I can say instead of load form, I can say it's condition. I can say conditional. I'm going to link that back to my multi-step form 2, target table. That doesn't matter so much. But then in the conditions, I put in what the actual condition is. So again, if I was looking at golf courses, I could say name equals Augusta. So let's just say I had a multi-step form where someone is adding a new golf course, and I say, oh, if they're adding Augusta, we want to do something different with them. Then you can say, put this condition name Augusta equals Augusta. Then what you have is normally you have next step, but then you also have if this thing fails, where do we go? So you can have 2 different options here as to where it goes if that condition is true and where it can go if it fails. I often get questions about like the syntax. Honestly, like this is really all the documentation that exists for the syntax. People will often ask like if I can refer to things from previous steps, and unfortunately you can't. So really it's like kind of more than 1 step away. So whatever was the record that existed in the previous step, that's what it's kind of doing a condition on. So you have kind of access to all those different attributes here, and then you can configure whether it's conditional or whether it passes or fails. What else did I want to talk about in sort of the form step? I did want to talk about you can, if you've got a form that has a bunch of tabs on it, you can just auto-generate steps from tabs. So rather than creating 4 steps, you can just create 1 form with 4 tabs on it, and you can just say, you check this box, and then this 1 step acts as 4 steps in the process. And then I did want to talk about just the progress bar. So we do have the progress bar. You can enable the progress bar, which shows up along the top. A super common request is to be able to like click on the progress bar and skip to steps. That doesn't exist. I've heard of people like building stuff like that, but it takes a lot of work to, you have to kind of get into the underlying data model of how it actually keeps track of where you are in the process. So out of the box, you just can't skip steps like that. And you can kind of tell it where you want the progress indicator to show, whether what the labels are, that sort of thing. So we are at time. Let me just see if we have any questions. Thank you, Jim, for the nice comment. So last question here, Kim. Do you have any tips on setting up dynamic lookup values when form loads or another field change event? Setting up dynamic lookup values. Kim, I'm not quite sure what you mean by setting dynamic lookup values when form loads or another field change event. Now, if you're talking about like having a lookup and actually setting the value, the thing, if you're in JavaScript and you're writing and you're setting a lookup, you have to set 3 things. You have to set the name of the table, you have to set the name of the record, and you have to set the ID of the record. So a lookup is actually represented as like 3 like HTML fields underneath. So if you are doing that, you have to make sure you're doing the name, the table, and the ID. You need the name of the table because some lookups can be multiple. If it's a lookup to customer, it might be a counter contact. So you need the name of the table, the actual name of the record, because that's what displays to the user, and you need the ID. Kim, if that's not your question, send me your question. Add me on LinkedIn or whatever. Send me your question that way, and I can help you out. Okay, thank you, everyone. Jason, I will let you finish up.
Great, thanks, Nick. Thanks as always. Just to wrap up, we will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to next month's event and a link to the recording when it's available. With that, I think we can conclude. Have a great day, everyone.